All right. So I'm Vicky. I'm Dr. Victoria Milner. I'm a clinical psychologist and an autism researcher. I've just finished my clinical training, and prior to doing my clinical training, I did a PhD that was looking at autism in women and girls, looking at barriers to diagnosis and to support. So I was really grateful when Justine and the PDU team invited me to do this talk today. I must admit, I asked ChatGPT to help me with a snappy title for the talk. So I went with unseen and underserved, but I realised that that second word kind of looks like undeserved, but it means underserved. Anyway, I'll get into that in just a moment, but thank you very much for having me. So this kind of goes over some of the things that Justine has already mentioned, but thank you very much. I know that lots of you have signed up today. I'm trying not to look at the number of you in the room, but thank you very much for all of you for coming. As Justine said, some of the content of today might personally affect you. Some of you might be autistic, and I will touch on topics such as mental health and physical health and severe and multiple disadvantage. So please do look after yourself and just take a break. It will be recorded, so you can always have a look back in the future. Throughout my talk, I'm aiming to use very neuroaffirmative and inclusive language. Language is always evolving, but I do try and use identity-first language. That means using autistic person rather than person with autism, and I'm trying to keep that in mind throughout. I also wanted to note that this is autism overall is a really evolving area of research. So what I talk about today might be out of date in a few years' time, but I've really enjoyed the opportunity to bring myself up to date with this research whilst I was developing this talk today. It's also worth noting that I'm not autistic myself, so I'm coming from a position of a non-autistic person. And throughout my talk, I've tried to make sure that I've cited and included resources from autistic people so that when you have the slides, you can go and have a look at those and really hear from the perspective of autistic people. I think that's really important. And then, as Justine said, there's a Q&A at the end, but I'm very happy to be emailed, and I've included my email in the slides as well. So what will I be talking about? So I've kind of split it up into two, I guess, sections. The first is thinking about unseen. So the historical context of autism, thinking about why autistic women and girls might be misdiagnosed as well. And then the second part thinks about, okay, what is that understood? How are autistic women and girls less supported, or what might their experiences be, and how might they be different to non-autistic women and girls, and also autistic boys and men? So, an overview of the history, just to provide a context and to really ground our understanding of how autism has evolved over the last century. And also, hopefully this will ground us in thinking about how this might have impacted the recognition of autism in women and girls as well. So Kanner and Asperger are often credited with the discovery of autism in the 1940s. But actually, if we look back, Bleuler initially used the word autism to describe characteristics or traits that they recognized within schizophrenia. They described autistic withdrawal and detachment from reality, and used really medicalized language such as pathological dominance of their inner life to describe symptoms that they saw within patients with schizophrenia. Then the word autism or autistic traits were described by Grunia Skoriva. I really hope I haven't butchered that pronunciation. But Grunia was a Ukrainian psychiatrist in the 1920s, and I only discovered her work whilst developing these slides, which is incredible because obviously it's about 100 years old, her work at the moment. And what's interesting about her work is that she began to speak about sex differences in autism, so differences between autistic boys and autistic girls that I'll go on to talk about today. And also the way that she describes autism and autistic traits is much more in line with our current understanding compared to what came after her with Kanner and Asperger as well. But interestingly, her work was not translated into the English language until the last 5 years, I believe, which is why her work is less well known and less well understood, at least in the English-speaking world. So then we go on to think about in the 1940s, we had Leo Kanner, who wrote descriptions or clinical observations of 11 children. 8 of those were boys and 3 of those were girls. And he described severe problems with social interaction and connectedness with others as well as resistance to change and insistence on sameness. The year after that, Hans Asperger described, I can't remember how many, I think there was only about 4 or 5 boys who he described to have social difficulties as well, and unusually circumscribed interests. The difference between what Kanner described and what Asperger described was that Kanner focused on children who had additional language delays or intellectual delays as well, whereas Asperger described children who did not have any of those delays and were of average or above average intellectual ability as well. But a lot of what we know about autism and the sort of history of autism has come from these accounts. These were the first accounts where autism was described as a separate entity and was not considered part of a schizophrenic presentation as well. And then we jump ahead into the 1970s, 1980s, where Lorna Wing and Judith Gold introduced the triad of impairments. And the triad of impairments described traits that they identified from the large sample of children in London. And they looked at differences in social communication, differences in social interaction, and social imagination as well. And their work really broadened our understanding of autism and what autism looks like. However, 94% of the participants that they based their work on were boys in their sample as well. So that's important to hold in mind. Then in the 1980s, and the third iteration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the book that is used to define the criteria for diagnoses, that's when what was called infantile autism was introduced. And this definition was really narrow, it was really rigid criteria that was in line with what Kanner had described in the 1940s. Then in 1994 became the 4th edition of the DSM, and they added different categories under the umbrella, and that included Asperger's disorder. So that was people with social communication difficulties and those rigid and repetitive behaviours that did not have the language delay or intellectual delay as well. And also PDD-NOS, which doesn't really roll off the tongue, which stands for pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So it was a really broad category of people who didn't quite meet that quite rigid criteria of infantile autism or Asperger's disorder. And there's evidence that at that time, a really large percentage of children who went for an assessment ended up with a PDD-NOS diagnosis. So it was really not very specific and not very sensitive as either. Then the DSM-5, so our latest edition of that manual, came out in 2013, and a quite controversial move at the time came that we got rid of all of the subcategories of autism, and all of the diagnoses were under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And it was an important shift in how we conceptualize autism, rather than being multiple different categories, to a single diagnosis that has a broad spectrum of presentations as well. And then more recently in the 21st century, there's been a real growing awareness of autism, different nuances and different presentations of autism, and also a movement, the neurodiversity movement. So thinking about autism not as a deficit, not as a disorder, but as a part of cognitive differences and the way brains work differently within the population as well. So that's just a bit of a history lesson to really embed us in our understanding there. But some really key important facts to help us think about why is this important, what is happening for autistic women and girls. So it used to be thought of male as a predominantly, autism was a predominantly male condition diagnosis, and some of the estimated gender ratios were around 4 males to 1 female diagnosed with autism. But some of the estimates, particularly in populations of people with Asperger's disorder, were 16 to 1, so 16 more males to 1 female with a diagnosis. More recent estimates are around 3 to 1 male to female, and the more we understand about this topic, the more we realise that there is a vast amount of women and girls who have been missed or haven't received a diagnosis of autism when they are in fact autistic. We know that on average, women and girls are diagnosed 6 years later than boys and men. We also know that even when referred for assessment at the same age or at the same time, girls have a longer wait times and longer assessment times, more thorough, or the amount of appointments that they have are longer than their male counterparts as well. And more recent evidence shows that up to 80% of autistic females are undiagnosed by the age of 18. And that's really important as well. I work clinically. I do a lot of autism assessments and diagnoses, and I'm meeting lots of autistic people in their adulthood, in later adulthood as well, who are recognizing traits within themselves that have been missed throughout their lives. So why is this happening? Why is this misdiagnosis and misdiagnosis happening? So there is evidence that there are differences in autistic presentations between autistic males and females. I'm going to talk a little bit about masking and what we mean by autistic masking today. There is some suggestion that the diagnostic tools that we use might be biased towards male presentation, and also thinking about diagnostic overshadowing, which again I'll go on to in a bit more detail. And then there is some evidence of maybe a genetic or biological differences between males and females that might explain the difference in diagnosis as well. So firstly, let's think about what might the differences be in an autism presentation. So the title of the slide is the female autism phenotype. And in 2020, this was put forward in the literature as a description of why women and girls may present differently to boys and men when going for an autism diagnosis. The title of or I guess the label of this has been disputed, and nowadays it's more thought of as like a nuanced phenotype or a nuanced presentation of autism, because it's recognised that there might be some people of different, any gender effectively, that might present in this way. But the idea is that it's against or different to the traditional presentation of autism while still meeting that criteria. And that's the key important thing. We're still meeting the criteria, it's just more subtle differences in their presentations. So I've started this presentation with the assumption that you're aware of what autism is, everyone who's coming today. But to get a diagnosis of autism, there are two main criteria that need to be met in terms of the traits. The first is what in the DSM, that diagnostic manual, defines as deficits. I've put that in quotation marks as I'm in my clinical practice, I try to use not pathologizing language, so I might use sort of differences or difficulties in social communication and interaction, but in the manual it says deficits, which is why I've included that there today. But what we might see in autistic females is that there might be fewer differences in speech. So for autistic males, we might see that the sort of volume or the rate or the rhythm or the intonation of speech might be different compared to non-autistic children. But we know that those differences are much less frequent and much more subtle for autistic females. We know that there might be more subtle difficulties, so not understanding things such as sarcasm, but on the language level, on the way that they sound in day-to-day conversation, might not be as different to their non-autistic counterparts. We know that for autistic females as well, there are fewer differences in non-verbal behaviour. So for traditional presentations of autism, we might see that there might be fewer facial expressions, fewer gestures used, but we know that for autistic females, there's evidence that there can be lots of gestures, almost exaggerated gestures, and the differences from non-autistic people is that they're often more exaggerated, they may be less well integrated within a person's speech, they might be described as theatrical or expressive, and that's what differentiates from more neurotypical or non-autistic presentations as well. We also know that traditionally, autistic people have been described as not being very socially motivated, as aloof, as preferring to be alone. And why that's true for lots of autistic people, for autistic women and girls, we know that there is a tendency to be highly socially motivated, to have a strong desire for friendships, but often to have either really intense friendships, that might be really intense one-to-one friendships, but with high levels of conflict, of breakdown within those relationships, or they might be part of a social group, but feel like they're on the outskirts or might be observed as being on the outskirts of that group. Some autistic people as well have a strong preference for control, so they might appear as the sort of leader of the group, but find it really difficult when that aspect of control is taken away or challenged by another person within that social dynamic, and that might be when we see a lot of social conflict within that. And for the autistic person themselves, they might have difficulty understanding why that conflict has happened, understanding sort of the differences, the nuances within friendships. This is particularly pertinent in adolescence when there is a lot of complexity within social interaction anyway, but for autistic girls that can be really difficult to navigate and to understand, and it can be really common to see that within friendships for autistic teenagers as well. common for autistic women and girls as well is difficulties recognizing, labeling, and communicating their own emotions. This is also known as alexithymia. So you might have heard that in passing. But it's really common for autistic people of all genders, but we see it particularly for autistic women and girls as well. Then going on to that B criteria, so thinking of restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests and activities. So traditionally, we might assume that autistic people have really intense passions and interests on the topics of which are different to their peers. So the stereotypical view might be an autistic boy that's really interested in trains, for example, or really interested in something that seems unusual, seems not as typical as other people at the same age as them. Whereas what we know for autistic women and girls is that their interests typically are very similar in topic to their peers. So what I mean by that, it might be that they're particularly interested in a pop band, or they might be really interested in horses, for example. And that topic of interest in itself isn't unusual, but what might be unusual is the intensity of that interest, the longevity of interest, and how deeply held it is. So if they are interrupted when engaging in that interest, that might be really distressing or difficult for them to move on from, or their topics of conversation might be dominated by that particular interest. They might have a real strong memory for facts and details about that interest. So those differences are there, but they might not be picked up on as much because someone might just think, oh, well, they're just interested in, for example, I was going to say One Direction, but that's probably quite outdated now, but a pop band or a boy band that their friends are interested in at the same time. We also know that within that B criteria, as I mentioned, a lot of autistic females have a strong preference for control. That can appear particularly in friendships, but also it can appear as anxiety a lot for autistic girls and women. So they might appear as anxious on the surface, and that's driven by that strong need for control, that strong level of predictability of structure as well. What's also reported as a lot more common in autistic females compared to autistic males is higher levels of sensory sensitivities. So this can include being oversensitive or hypersensitive to different senses. That can be sounds or tastes or textures, any of the senses, or undersensitive as well. So that could be, for example, not detecting if something's really hot on their skin and then it impacting or burning their skin, or being undersensitive to internal cues, so whether they're hungry or whether they're tired or thirsty as well. And it can also be sensory seeking or sensory aversion as well. We also know that for autistic women and girls, there are fewer stereotyped and repetitive behaviours. So what we mean by that is what we call stimming. So that might be behaviours such as slapping of hands or spinning around, or repetitive bodily movements that are often used to soothe people or to regulate different emotions, whether that's positive emotions or negative emotions. But we see that less often in autistic women and girls compared to autistic women and boys as well. So I guess the main point of the slide, or the takeaway from the slide, is that there are these differences in how autism presents in autistic women and girls as well. So a lot of you might have heard of autistic masking. Some people just call it autistic camouflaging as well. What we mean by this is a conscious or unconscious strategy to mask social differences or traits of autism, and also to fit in within social circles as well. And to a certain extent, everybody, regardless of whether they're autistic or not, makes adaptations to how they interact in the different social circumstances. So, for example, how I interact with my colleagues is going to be different to how I interact with my friends or my partner or my family. How I interact with my grandparents is going to be different to how I interact with my friends, for example. However, the difference with autistic people's experiences of this is that it's the intuitive nature of it. It's less intuitive, those differences, those adaptations that they might make in social situations. And it's more often learnt behaviour, whether that's consciously or unconscious as well. We also know that it takes a lot more effort because that it's less intuitive, and it has a lot more detrimental impact as well, which I'll go on to in just a moment. But some of the strategies that might come under that masking umbrella include things like learning or rehearsing social scripts or different questions to ask when you're in a conversation, or having certain jokes that you can use, or different ways of indicating humour to mask social differences or social difficulties. It might be that autistic people study the characteristics of others, and that can be a real person, someone who they might deem as socially successful, or it could be someone fictional, someone they've read a character in a book, or someone they've seen in film or TV, and mimic and copy that behaviour when around others. It might also be modulating the non-verbal behaviours. So, for example, engaging in eye contact when that's less intuitive, and sometimes that can be even painful for some autistic people, but engaging in eye contact and having to think consciously about, okay, how long will I engage in eye contact? Is this too much? When will I stop? When will I start? How do I navigate this really complex non-verbal behaviour? And that's similar for facial expressions as well. So it might be about really paying attention to how their face is and sort of holding a face in a social setting, and also gestures as well. And also, I guess, body language in terms of how close you're standing to somebody, how you might interact, or whether it's appropriate to touch someone in a social setting or not, that kind of thing. It's less intuitive, much more intentional behaviour as well. It might be around suppressing stims. So I talked then about that behaviour, the repetitive behaviour to regulate emotions, might be suppressing those movements. I also should have said in that previous slide, the differences in gender that we often see is that stimming behaviour for autistic girls is often things that are deemed less unusual. So it might be, for example, like twirling hair, or like flicking fingers, things like that, that are less obvious to the unobserver and might not be picked up then as an autistic trait or as an autistic characteristic. Another type of masking might be avoiding talking about interests. So they might be aware that people might not share that interest, or that the intensity of their interest is different. They might then not talk about it as much and have those stock phrases or things that they talk about. They also oh yeah, this is another interesting one. They might, a lot of autistic people that I've worked with have reported that they befriend people who might be deemed as quirky or unusual groups of people, because those groups of people might tend to be more accepting. They feel that they can be more themselves. There's more differences already within those groups, and those groups, there's less pressure to be a certain way within those groups that might be of different cultures or of different quirks or of different ways of being as well. Another example is using a friend as a social crutch in a group. So this might be someone who the autistic person feels really, really comfortable with. And when they're with that person, they know that that person might initiate conversations or might drive conversations, or they just know that they bounce off that person and feel more comfortable with that person. So they tend to be seen with that person a lot more, or feel more comfortable in social settings with that person. But when that person's not there, that's when the social differences might be more apparent to others. They might find it more difficult to engage in conversation, or to maintain friendships or interactions without that person there. There are lots more strategies that fit under the masking umbrella, but those are just a few that I have selected to talk about today. And it's really important to think about how masking then interacts with the recognition of autism within women and girls. So within the diagnostic manual that I talked about, in the 5th edition, so the most recent edition, it explicitly talks about how some individuals will have developed compensatory strategies to support some of the social challenges that they have, but they will the way that it's differentiated between people, anybody who might adapt how they are in social settings, and for autistic people, is that in novel or unstructured situations, they might find it more difficult. And the effort and the anxiety that it might cause when masking has a significant impact on them and their day-to-day functioning and their day-to-day experience of living as well. So it's explicitly stated within the manual about masking. It's been found in the literature that the level of autistic traits observed changes throughout the lifespan. So when in younger children, males have significantly higher traits than girls. As they go through adolescence, that difference reduces significantly. So there is more similarities in the number of autistic traits between adolescent males and adolescent females who are autistic. And what that suggests is that in adolescence, the social demand outweighs a person's ability to mask. So what I mean by that is because of the complexity of the social dynamics in adolescence, there is a lot more demand, there's a lot more pressure, just because of the developmental stage of life. If a person in their childhood has been able to stick to the structure of school and they're really well supported at home, and their parents organise all of their play dates, and there's no pressure on them to um, well, I guess the pressure of them is reduced and they're more able to mask and to cope in that situation. As soon as that's stripped away and those complexities are added, that's when we might notice more difficulties for autistic women and girls because their ability to mask has reduced. Their autistic traits will be more recognised. And that's why there is that delay in recognition and in diagnosis, or one of the reasons why there is that delay for autistic women and girls as well. It's important to say that people of all genders, autistic people of all genders, may mask to some extent. However, there is a lot of evidence that autistic females are more likely to mask and that they mask more often, and to a higher extent than autistic males. And there's a lot of discussion around why that might be. There's some arguments that it's more accepting to be autistic if you're male because of that history, of that context of it being deemed a male condition. Or it could just be in terms of gender differences in the general population as well. There's more pressure on women to be social, to be in social groups, but there's a lot of discussion around why that might be. But that is what the evidence shows us at the moment. But important, we know that high levels of camouflaging or masking does predict later diagnosis, and it also indicates or leads to poorer well-being for autistic women and girls as well. So I need to pick up the pace because I've got a lot to get through. So I'm going to speak a little bit more briefly on these slides. But one of another reasons why autistic women and girls might be less recognised and why there might be those delays in diagnosis is because of the tools that we've used. So the reason I gave that history at the beginning is to give that context of the majority of the research that we had in the last century has predominantly been male samples. So all of the evidence that we have, well, not all of it, but the majority of the evidence that we have are predominantly from boys and girls, boys and men. Our understanding, therefore, is biased towards the more traditional presentations of autism, the more stereotyped presentation of autism. And therefore, we have less evidence on the nuance, or what we might call the female phenotype presentation of autism as well. And all of the tools that we use, or the gold standard tools that we use within autism assessments, are based on that research, are based on that evidence, and they're developed in line with that traditional presentation. So there's an argument that the tools that we use are less sensitive to picking up those nuances, those more subtle difficulties and differences that I described a bit earlier on. So, for example, some of the tools might think about, are there gestures present? And if there are gestures present and they seem to be occurring as frequently enough, then a person like on that particular item wouldn't meet criteria for autism. Obviously, we don't use algorithms on their own. That's not simply you're above a threshold or you're not above or you're below a threshold. Clinicians hopefully take in a lot more information, and it's much more holistic. But it is an important consideration that the tools that we're using maybe aren't picking up some of those differences and the traits. Also, in terms of the diagnostic process, there is limited training, or there's less training in those more nuanced presentations in these differences for autistic women and girls, for key stakeholders such as clinicians who might be making referrals or who might be doing the assessments, but also for other people. So, for example, teachers who might be the people who first recognise traits of autism and make an initial referral, who might discuss it with parents. But anybody working in any service has limited training about these nuanced presentations of autism in women and girls. On a more positive note, there has been a lot more development in more recent years about different tools that we can use, so different questionnaires, different tools for clinicians to improve the assessment for women and girls. And it also does explicitly state in the diagnostic manual that there might be differences for women and girls as well. So hopefully clinicians are aware of this, but we know in practice that people have really difficult experiences when they go for assessment. They don't feel heard. They don't feel that their internal experiences have been explored, because things are taking that surface value. And also because within the assessment process, it's often, for example, like an hour-long ADOS. An ADOS is one of the tools that we use within the assessment. An hour long, a person could be masking within that time. They might not feel comfortable with the clinician to really show their true self, and they might be the masking strategies might be so ingrained that they don't know who they are when they're not masking. And so it's really difficult for them to express their true selves in the assessment process, and therefore their difficulties might be missed. So yeah, the way that we're diagnosing, the tools that we're using are also impacting the recognition and the diagnosis of autism in women and girls. So briefly thinking about what's called diagnostic overshadowing. So diagnostic overshadowing is when the traits or symptoms of another diagnosis overshadows. I'm just basically explaining the title. So basically, a lot of autistic women and girls are diagnosed with a mental health condition prior to receiving their autism diagnosis. So this it's really common for people to get a diagnosis of anxiety, of low mood and depression, but also of diagnoses such as emotionally unstable personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. And often these symptoms of those diagnoses are used to explain the characteristics that are better explained by autism, which means that someone might be in treatment for anxiety, for example, which is a mental health condition that can be treated, that people can get support for, and their anxiety is still there because it's driven by their autistic characteristics. So that it's driven by their preference for sameness, by their intolerance of uncertainty, of their need of control, rather than it being driven by having a mental health diagnosis. And that can be a real barrier then to the recognition of autism, to self-understanding, and it can also have a further detrimental impact on mental health because people may go through years of intervention for what's thought of as an anxiety disorder, but actually might be better explained by an autistic trait. It also works in reverse. So autistic people might be underdiagnosed for a mental health condition because someone might say, oh, well, that's just because they're autistic, whereas actually it's not just a given that autistic people are anxious, and they do require support and they do need help as well. So it works both ways, but a lot of literature has shown that autistic women, the majority of autistic women have a diagnosis of at least one mental health condition prior to getting an autism diagnosis. And interestingly, a paper came out this year that showed that they looked at the stability of the mental health diagnosis, and for a large proportion of autistic women and girls, the mental health diagnosis was no longer deemed accurate or relevant after they'd received the autism diagnosis. So what this meant was that the autism diagnosis better explained their experiences than prior mental health diagnosis. I hope that made sense. I went through it quite quickly, but I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end if there are any. And I guess maybe this would have made more sense to come at the start, but because of that historical context of how we've understood autism, of the predominantly male samples in our research, and the presentation of autism in popular media, such as thinking about Rain Man, the film, that's a very stereotypical presentation of autism, or Sheldon and the Big Bang Theory, there's quite a lot of male stereotypical autistic presentations represented in the general population, but much, much fewer presentations of that, what we might see as more typical in autistic women and girls as well. So there is this, in the general population, just a stereotype of what we would expect when we meet an autistic person, and that therefore a barrier to recognition of autistic traits. We also know that there's evidence that gendered expectations, so regardless of no, not regardless of, actually, ignore what I was going to say. Gendered expectations are also a barrier. So for autistic girls, they're often described as shy, or they're encouraged to be quiet, or they're encouraged to be clean because of gendered expectations of what a girl should or could be. Whereas for boys, it's more expected that they might be more boisterous, more messy, more bit of a rule breakers, and therefore it's more obvious when things are perhaps different to their peers. Whereas for an autistic girl, their differences might be described as, or where they're just shy as well. I hope that makes sense. This is a really interesting graphic, although I just realised it's quite blurry, but it's from the Autistic Girls Network, so it's not my own image, but it gives reasons that autistic women and girls received as to why they were not given a referral or a diagnosis of autism. So I'm not going to read these all out, but there's things such as they have friends. And that just shows that there's this stereotype, there's this assumption that autistic people aren't socially motivated, they will not have friends, whereas actually we know that's not true. They make eye contact, they talk too much, they could hold a conversation, they're not violent or repetitive. And I think all of these examples really highlight those stereotypes that we hold about autism, and also indicate the barriers that there are to diagnosis for autistic women and girls, or anyone of any gender who presents in a more nuanced way. This slide I'm going to be really quick on, because even though I've read so many things about genetics and heritability and all of those things, it still goes over my head a little bit. So I'm going to give a very basic overview of what my understanding is of this. But there are some theories as to why men or males are more likely to be diagnosed with autism than females at a biological level or genetic level. So there were some theories put forward. So, for example, the extreme male brain theory was put forward by Baron Cohen in the 90s. This idea that men are more likely to have this systemizing way of thinking, or males, sorry, and females are more likely to be empathetic and emotional, and that autistic people, regardless of their gender, tend to sit on that more systemizing end of the spectrum. The theory itself has been highly critiqued, and there's been really inconsistent evidence for this as well. So when I share the slides, I've got a link that talks about the critiques and gives an overview of this as well, but it's just one of the theories that attempts to explain why these gender differences might exist. The female protective effect is another theory that talks about females needing a higher genetic load or high genetic risk factors, so use language, to display autistic traits. So if a person has the same level of genetic load, a male will show autistic traits, whereas a female won't show an autistic trait, regardless of the same level of genetics. Again, the evidence for this is inconsistent, but this is one of the theories that might explain why males are more likely to get a diagnosis, particularly because the tests that we have, or the way that we assess autism, is behavioural. We make observations, we have interviews, we learn from the individual and people who know them really, really well. There's no genetic test, there's no blood test for autism. So this is just one of the explanations as to why that difference might exist. And then this is the one that, again, I've read lots of things about it, but it still goes over my head a little bit more. But thinking about the heritability, so the genetics for autism are more heritable in males, slightly more than in females as well. And I think that means that the additive effect of genetics is higher in males than females. But again, there's inconsistent evidence for this. It's quite a I can never say the word, preliminary finding for one of the explanations as to why there are differences in diagnostic rates of autism. So those slides think then about why autistic women and girls might be less recognised, be less likely to be referred, and less likely to receive a diagnosis. And the second part of what I want to talk about for the next sort of 15-20 minutes or so is thinking about what's the impact of that? How are we supporting autistic women and girls after they get a diagnosis, or even if they don't have a formal diagnosis, once they recognise it within themselves and they self-identify as being autistic as well. So, firstly, thinking about mental health. So we know that autistic people of all genders are significantly more likely to have a mental health difficulty compared to people who aren't autistic. Up to 70% of autistic people have at least one mental health diagnosis. the differences between autistic girls and autistic boys is that in childhood, autistic girls are more likely to experience internalized mental health difficulties such as anxiety or low mood, whereas boys are more likely to at least be diagnosed with more externalized presentations such as what might be called conduct disorder or ADHD as well, which is more of an externalized presentation. I know ADHD isn't a mental health diagnosis, they sometimes include it within the sort of psychiatric diagnosis umbrella as well. In adulthood as well, women have higher odds or higher likelihood of developing most mental health conditions compared to autistic males. So one example of this is that over 50% of autistic females receive at least a preceding psychiatric diagnosis compared to 40% of males. So there's still a high prevalence for autistic males. It's just that the prevalence is higher for autistic females. Another example is that within eating disorder populations, there's evidence that around 30% of people with eating disorders are autistic, but the majority of those people don't have a diagnosis. And the majority of people with eating disorders are women and girls. So there's still an evolving area of research in this field, but there are differences in the type of mental health conditions that autistic women and girls experience, and the severity and the amount of people who might experience those difficulties as well. Similar stats are reported for physical health. So we know that autistic women and girls are more likely to be diagnosed with many different physical health diagnoses compared to non-autistic women and also to autistic men and boys. And this is true for lots of different categories. Some diagnostic criteria have stronger evidence than others. So we know that for sleep disorder and for epilepsy, there is this quite consistent evidence that those are more prevalent within autistic women and girls compared to autistic women and boys and within the non-autistic population. The same goes for epilepsy. And then there is slightly less consistent evidence for the other conditions. So for musculoskeletal conditions, for gastrointestinal conditions, oh my gosh, I can never say these words. I'm just going to let you read these words so that I don't have to mispronounce, I can't even say that word, these statistics as well. But the main take-home message here is that there is a higher prevalence of physical health needs and conditions for autistic women and girls compared to the other groups that I've mentioned. I thought it would be amiss to not include a slide about menstruation and menopause, because these are stages of development that impact all women and girls, or people who menstruate and experience menopause. But there are significant differences for autistic people compared to non-autistic people who go through these developmental stages. I want to caveat this with this is a really under-researched area in general, so for the general population, not just autistic people, but especially for autistic women and girls. And there's a lot of evidence coming through in the last year or so for this, but there still needs to be a lot more work done in this area. But we know that for autistic women and girls, when they experience puberty, so when the onset of their periods and they begin to menstruate, and also each month or however regularly they menstruate, they experience greater difficulties of emotion regulation and also more sensory difficulties as well. So it's really common, for example, to experience things like cramps, nausea, all of those physical symptoms that come with menstruation and menopause and all of those wonderful things that women and girls experience. But these are really heightened for autistic people because they have the existing differences anyway. They're more likely to experience those sensory differences anyway. They're more likely to experience differences and difficulties with emotion regulation anyway. And those differences are worsened when hormones change and hormones fluctuate throughout their lives as well. But like I said, a lot of research needs to be done in this area to improve the support for all women, but particularly for autistic women and girls experiencing this. So as PD is around severe and multiple disadvantage, it would be silly of me not to include slides about this. So I've included some of the statistics that we know, or some of the information that we know from the evidence of what autistic women and girls might be experiencing. I've put here though as well that it's important to acknowledge that autistic women and girls or autistic people of all genders have lots of different strengths as well. And I've not included those in the slides today, but I've included links at the end that really describe that and really emphasize the strengths that autistic people have. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the difficulties, the discrimination, and the challenges that autistic people experience, in the hope that then that influences us in our workplace, in our practice, and we can have a little think about what adaptations or what we can do differently to support this as well. So we know that people who are neurodivergent, who are autistic, are more likely to experience discrimination, to experience bullying, and to have smaller social support networks as well. We know that autistic people have increased difficulties accessing services, and this can be for lots of different reasons, but particularly for communication difficulties or cognitive differences as well, not understanding what the expectations are, finding it very difficult to, for example, make a phone call or to understand if there's inconsistencies with what information is needed, what they need to provide, that kind of thing. There are lots of barriers. And also there are things like environmental barriers. So if the service is in a really noisy environment or it's difficult to navigate how to get to that service, like practically get there, that can be a barrier as well. We also know that autistic women and girls are very they have an increased vulnerability to victimization, to domestic abuse, and to sexual abuse as well. There are some really shocking statistics that one paper reported 70% of autistic women reported sexual assault and sexual abuse. So there is a high vulnerability there to abuse as well. We also know that, as I've talked about already, there's high prevalence of coexisting mental health diagnoses. We also know that many autistic people may use substances such as alcohol or drugs to help mask their difficulties, to help them fit in, to help them feel comfortable in social situations, and to navigate really complex social situations. But of course, that then leads to vulnerability to increased risk of addiction as well, which can be really difficult to navigate. And we also, there's evidence to show that autistic people in general are significantly more likely to die by suicide, with autistic women being 3 times more likely to die by suicide than people who are not autistic as well. My background as well is thinking about, I've worked in homelessness services and thought about autistic people's experience of homelessness. And we know that autistic women are more likely to experience what we call hidden homelessness. So what that means is homelessness that's not visible, like as easily visible. So it's not rough sleeping. It might be things like sofa surfing. It might be staying in temporary accommodation. It might be staying in hotels or hostels. It's less obvious to the public. And what we call hidden homelessness. But the problem with that is that it's really difficult for services to reach people who are experiencing this type of homelessness as well. We know that autistic women and girls might be more likely to engage in risky relationships. I've talked then about the increased risk of abuse and of victimization, of discrimination. And due to differences or difficulties navigating really complex social dynamics, or perhaps being more socially naive and having less understanding of what a healthy or a appropriate relationship might look like, they might be more likely then to stay or remain in a risky relationship just to have a roof over their head as well. And I've talked a little bit then about limited access to services due to those more practical or communication difficulties, but also due to increased vulnerability and to increased risk as well. I mentioned there that I've been involved in research about autism and homelessness services, and one of the pieces of research that I did recently found that staff working in homelessness services were less accurate at recognising nuanced presentations, so what we call maybe the more female presentations, compared to the traditional presentations of autism as well. So we're nearly there. We're nearly at the end. Just 2 more slides. So what can we do? I know there's people from lots of different backgrounds in the talk today, and we'll be working in lots of different areas, but I think there are some things that everybody can do to help improve recognition of autism for men and girls, and to also improve support when we recognise autistic traits in autistic women and girls as well. So firstly is just to continue improving your understanding, your awareness, your recognition. I've included lots of resources that can be shared in the slides. There's a slide that's got resources on, but also in the notes section as well. Also, I encourage you to reflect on what biases or assumptions or views of autism we might have. We're so heavily influenced by what we see, what we read, and because those stereotypes have been so predominantly based on male presentations, it's really important to sit and reflect on, actually, maybe, you might begin to recognize it in other people that you know as well, if you reflect on your assumptions that you have about autism. We can also make person-centered adaptations to your practice. So I haven't had time to go into detail about adaptations today. That's a whole other slide, a whole other presentation. But thinking about, there's that cliche phrase that you've probably all heard of, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because there's such a broad range of presentations that it's really important to get to know the person, to think about what they need to have adapted, or what support they need in place. That might be communication changes in the way you communicate. It might be environmental changes. It might be having really concrete expectations or predictable patterns of when you're going to see them, when you're going to support them, that kind of thing as well. And also, as much as possible, we can work to reduce pressure to mask by creating inclusive environments and making adaptations, as I mentioned above. And that's a bit easier said than done. I think a lot of people read that and think, well, how do we do that? How do we reduce the pressure to mask? And it's not a simple answer. It's about getting to know the individual, about modelling it as well, about modelling maybe if you have characteristics or traits that you might suppress consciously or even subconsciously, whether they're autistic or not, modelling that being inclusive and accepted within the environment. And yeah, I don't have time to go into that right now, but there's lots of different ways that we can start to think about how to make environments more inclusive. And I'm sure you all have lots of ideas, and you're probably already doing lots of things to make the way you work more inclusive anyway. So it'd be great to hear from you as well. And then to end on this, why does this matter? So we know that early recognition of autism and an early diagnosis of autism leads to early support, and we know that that then leads to better outcomes for autistic people. And by better outcomes, we mean mental health outcomes, general well-being, but also things like employment outcomes if that person wants to work, educational outcomes, just general day-to-day functioning and independence and quality of life outcomes are better with earlier diagnosis and earlier support. We also know that improved understanding reduces stigma, reduces stereotypes and assumptions as well. And not just stigma from other people, but also internalized stigma. So improved understand, if you have an earlier diagnosis, you might have a better understanding of yourself, better understanding of your own identity as well, which has an impact on outcomes and functioning and quality of life. We also know that improved awareness and understanding helps improve inclusive practices. So it helps reduce assumptions. It helps people reflect on the way that they're working. Is it inclusive? Is it appropriate for everybody that they're serving? And as I've talked about before, and I guess it ties into a lot of these, the way that we understand others reduces a person's need to mask. And we know that there is a significant effort and a significant detrimental impact that comes with masking and camouflaging as well. So it's important to try and reduce the need for that to happen as much as possible to help improve the well-being of the autistic people that we support. So that's the end of the content. Very happy to answer any questions. I've listed some resources. As I mentioned, a lot of them are written by autistic people, by autistic women and girls. And I think that's really key and really important. For anyone working in homelessness services, there is a toolkit that's been written, and the second edition has resources and information particularly about autism in women and girls. And yeah, I'll leave this for when you can have the slides, so you can click on these. And that's everything. So thank you very much for listening. You can email me with any questions, and yeah, happy to answer them now as well in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you ever so much, Vicky. That was really interesting, and people have been putting comments in the chat box as we've gone along. We've got a few questions as well. So So if anyone else has got any questions that they want to just pop in the chat box while we go through these first few, then please do so. And like Vicky said, you'll get the slides with all of the information and links and things in as well. They'll be following out shortly. So the first question asks, what is your opinion on the overdiagnosis in women of personality disorders? And do you think that the underdiagnosis of women with autism is related to this?
That's really interesting. I've met a lot of autistic women who have received a diagnosis of personality disorder earlier in their life, and they really fought to get rid of that diagnosis because they didn't feel that it best fit their experience. And once they learned about the nuances of different autism presentations, they recognized themselves as being autistic, and they felt that that personality disorder didn't fit anymore. And I think that's really common. I think if we think about some of the overlapping symptoms, there can be that emotional regulation difficulties in both personality disorders and in autism. There can be really intense friendships and conflict within friendships as well that can be seen in both diagnoses. But I think it's really common that there is that misdiagnosis of personality disorder for a lot of autistic women. But that's not to say, or to caveat there, that autistic people of any gender can also have a co-occurring diagnosis of a personality disorder as well, and might want to receive support for that as well. So yes, I do. There is an overlap. There's a lot of misdiagnosis, but with the caveat that coexisting diagnoses do exist as well. Hopefully that answered that question.
Thank you, Vicky. The next question asks, you mentioned a paper on the stability of mental health diagnoses. Could you share the author and title?
Yeah, don't know the title off the top of my head, but it was by Miriam Martini and colleagues. I'll put it in when I share the slides. I can share a new version. I make sure that the link's in there on the slides. But it was 2025, and the lead author was Miriam Martini.
Lovely, thank you, Vicky. And the next question asks, I'm aware women from non-white backgrounds may have different, or brackets, more difficult experiences in seeking a diagnosis and accessing support. Could you share some thoughts, in brackets, if any, in relation to this, please?
Yes. Hi, Catherine, by the way. I can see the question. Yes, so non-white people of any gender face greater barriers of getting a diagnosis. And again, that's to do with stereotypes and assumptions about different behavioural presentations. So I think, yeah, I guess that there are difficulties. I don't know off the top of my head sort of explicit things to add and to explain to that. But people of non-white backgrounds do have more difficulties, again, due to the recognition of traits that might be assumed to be due to different cultural differences, or for example, I know that there's evidence that Black children might be perceived differently as white children in terms of their behaviour and what's deemed typical and what's not deemed typical as well. So there's more research that's needed in that area, as there are in all areas. But yeah, there are additional barriers for people who are from non-white backgrounds.
Thank you. So the next question says, I work with group homes who support female rough sleepers. I'm wondering if there is a generic care plan that we can use.
So in terms of a generic care plan, there are things like a communication passport that a lot of autistic people find helpful. Again, I can put this in the resources link, and what that does is it gives a brief overview of a person's preferences in terms of how they communicate, whether that's verbal, written, whether they prefer like very literal, or whatever differences they might have in terms of their communication. And it also might detail things like sensory needs or needs around predictability. If you just Google communication passports, there are lots that exist. And also within the homelessness and autism toolkit, they have a lot of helpful tools that you can use within your practice. So there's things like a checklist that might be about traits that you might recognise, help you recognise traits within the people you support. And also talks about adaptations that you might make to the care that you provide. So I would recommend Googling communication passports and then also looking at the Autism and Homelessness Toolkit as well. And for that.
Thank you, Vicky. And this is the last question, unless anyone else has got anything that they want to pop in the Q&A box. So it just asks, can you explain how best to manage anxiety and speak about it as part of autism rather than a separate condition?
How to manage it. So that's interesting because we know that autistic people are more likely to experience anxiety. And we can think about that in lots of different ways. Like everybody experiences anxiety to some extent in for lots of different reasons. But a lot of autistic people describe living in a world that's not designed for them. And that in itself can be really anxiety provoking. Some people describe it as they use the metaphor of going to a country where they don't speak the same language as you and expecting to function the same as people who are able to speak that language, which of course can be quite anxiety provoking. And I might have misunderstood this question, but I think it's important to differentiate anxiety and autism. It's not, and what I mean by that is anxiety is a mental health disorder rather than feeling anxious generally. So I think it is important to separate the two because, for example, anxiety you might go to receive treatment for, whereas autism itself is an identity. It's part of a person, part of who they are. So there are different ways that you would approach that. In terms of approaching it for a person who might be autistic and also have an anxiety disorder, then I think it's important for the person who's supporting them to recognise that the way that they're experiencing the world and anxiety might be different. There might be different reasons that they're feeling anxious, and also there might be different ways that they can adapt to help them feel less anxious without putting pressure on them to mask, because it's a real difficult line between having strategies that reduce anxiety and fitting in but increasing masking, which then in turn increases anxiety. So it's a really difficult line to tread. I think the best piece of advice is just really hearing from that person what their experiences are, really trying to get a good formulation and understanding of what are the causes of their anxiety, how they experience anxiety day to day, and what that comes up as for them. And not introducing strategies that could be masking their autistic traits. I don't know if that makes sense or if that was addressing the question appropriately. But yeah, that's what came to mind.
Thank you, Vicky. So we've had a couple more questions come in since you were just answering that last one. So the next one says, can you recommend any books that cover teenage girls with autism leading into adulthood and the challenges they can experience?
Yeah, there are quite a few books actually that have come out more recently. There's one that's particularly, I can't remember what the topic is, the title is off my head, but there's one that's particularly about puberty and adolescence for autistic girls. I think it might be called like the Autistic Girl Survival Guide or something like that. That I know autistic people that I've worked with have found really helpful, and some parents of autistic people that I've worked with have recommended it to me as well. There's others called about masking and sort of allowing people to be their authentic selves and reduce masking. One's called Unmasked and one's called Girl, Unmasked. And I'm sure there are more, but those are the ones that come to the top of my head. So I can, again, put them in the resources when we share the slides so that you can have a look at them. But there are quite a lot of books out at the moment, and importantly, they're written by autistic people, which I think is really key and really important. So it really, yeah, they're really great in that way.
Thank you, Vicky. So the last question says that I'm an assistant psychologist who works in a women-only homelessness service. I lead meditation and mindfulness sessions. I'm also certified as a mindfulness teacher, but a lot of individuals I support struggled with visualizations in mindfulness exercises or don't connect with breathing, grounding. And many of these women suspect they have autism. What modifications can I offer to mindfulness and wellbeing sessions to be more inclusive?
That's interesting. I found that as well when I've worked with autistic women. What I found helpful is to use more, um, what's the word? Like less visual mindfulness. So, for example, it might be holding an object and paying attention to that object in the moment. But also, I think it's about being mindful of what that person's sensory needs are, whether if they're hyper or hyposensitive to different senses, then it might be aversive or particularly enjoyable for them. Um, but I've found, yeah, like that sort of in the moment physical mindfulness exercise sometimes being more helpful than the visual imagery exercises as well. Um, that's the main thing off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are other things I can't think of right now. But yeah, that's the main thing that comes to the top of my head.
Thank you. We've got another question that's just come in. So it says, do you think lots of autistic people have digestive issues like IBS or GERD, gastric reflux? I think it's gastric reflux disorder, maybe, due to the stress brain connection and not just as a symptom, in inverted commas, of being autistic.
Um, I think it's probable. I don't know what the research is around that, but I think there's a lot more research coming out about the sort of the gut, the brain, how it's all connected, and I think it's probable that in a few years that will be apparent that the experiences that autistic people have might increase the stress chemicals that we have in our body that then might influence the physical symptoms that they're experiencing. But yeah, like I said, I don't know the research off the top of my head, so can't say for definite, but I think it's probable that that will come out in the future.
Thank you, Vicky. Someone's just popped another question in the chat box, and they're just saying thank you for the presentation. How would you recommend initially bringing up the topic with somebody that you suspect has autism, but they have not been diagnosed?
Mm. It's difficult because you would know the person better than I will, and it'll be different for each person. When I've done it before, I've sort of framed it as I've noticed X, Y, and Z, and some of the people who I've worked with who've had similar traits have been autistic. Is this something that you've ever thought of? Or it might be a gentle opening of have they ever heard of autism? What is their understanding of it? Because often people come with assumptions and stereotypes and maybe some stigma around autism. So it might be worth opening in with just exploring what their understanding is and really setting the scene to be neuroaffirming, having more of a strengths focused space of autism, and maybe proposing it as a possible explanation for some of the challenges or differences that they experience in life. But I think a good setting the scene or setting the conversation up as neuroaffirming as possible, as strengths focused as possible, as open as possible as well for whatever assumptions that they might have about autism is a good way to go. And also I think about allowing people time to maybe process it. So the first time that you might suggest it to a person or bring it up as an idea, they might have a very different reaction to how they then might respond in a next time you see them or in the future as well. So it might be about giving them space to think about it, to go off do their own research, depending on who they are, and then coming back and having a further conversation if they want to, and sort of leaving it up to them. But ultimately, you can make adaptations to the way you support someone, regardless of whether they have a diagnosis. So if you're recognizing traits or you suspect a person might be autistic, you can have a conversation at a trait level. You can say, I've noticed that you really like it when our sessions are at the same time every week, or I've noticed that you're very sensitive when the room's really noisy. So shall we have a think about how we can make those adaptations for you, rather than saying you need to have a diagnosis first and then we can make those adaptations. So yeah, hopefully those suggestions might be helpful as well.
Thank you, Vicky. So that's the last question. But thank you very much, Vicky, for attending today and presenting for this learning series. And